Hello YouTube, Sidekick here with the new Kola Map. So I thought I would do a first impressions video. There's probably actually been a fair bit of traffic on this out there, so I thought maybe I'd start off, instead of talking about the map itself, I'd talk about why we would want a map of the Kola Peninsula. To be clear, it's called the Kola Peninsula map, but it actually includes significant portions of northern Finland, northern Sweden, and northern Norway, as well as the Kola Peninsula, which is, of course, part of Russia or the Soviet Union, depending on which time period we're talking about. Now, during the Cold War, which I think is the time period when the Kola Peninsula is probably the most interesting, during the Cold War, the Kola Peninsula itself was, as it is, home to the Russian or Soviet Northern Fleet. Now, that Northern Fleet included Soviet nuclear attack submarines that were going to sortie into the Atlantic or try to defend the near waters of the Soviet Union from NATO nuclear attack submarines, principally United States Navy nuclear attack submarines. But it was also the home of Russia's ballistic missile submarine fleet. Now, the Russians, unlike the Americans, expected their ballistic missile submarines to operate fairly close to home, basically in the Barents Sea, or pretty much off the coast of the Kola Peninsula. So the Kola Peninsula was also home to a significant number of surface units, particularly anti-submarine warfare units that were supposed to protect the boomers while they were at sea. But the Northern Fleet also included enough surface units to be able to be capable of fielding amphibious assault groups to attack the Norwegian North Sea coast. Now, in terms of air forces, the Kola was home to large numbers of Soviet naval aviation bombers, basically backfires and bears, whose mission would have been, in the event of a Cold War going hot, their mission would have been to interdict NATO Atlantic convoys by flying basically across the top of the Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom gap and down into the mid-Atlantic. Now, it was also, the Kola Peninsula was also home to a large number of high-altitude interceptors, whose mission would have been to prevent NATO strategic bombers flying over the pole from reaching the Russian heartland. So, that's what the Soviet Cold War order of battle in the region pretty much would have looked like. And what about NATO and the other Nordic countries that were not part of NATO? Well, Finland was the country most directly in the path of the Soviet steamroller. I don't know very much about what the Finns expected to do, but I do know that the Soviets expected that the Finns would not only remain neutral, but that they were also expected not to contest Soviet use of their territory in order to get at either Norway or Sweden. Sweden, too, was officially expected to be neutral, but here the situation was maybe a little less certain. Although Sweden was not a member of NATO, there was, I think, a strong feeling in Sweden and in NATO, and frankly in the Soviet Union, that Sweden would likely be drawn into any conflict between NATO and the Warsaw Pact on the NATO side. If that happened, this area could well have been the site of some significant action on the ground. The Soviets had 8 or 10 divisions in the Kola Peninsula that were earmarked for the invasion of Sweden. Now, the map also includes a very small portion of the Finnish and Swedish coasts at the top of the Gulf of Bothnia, which is an extension of the Baltic Sea. Now, those coasts might also have been the target for an amphibious assault, so that's something that we could model on the Kola map. Now, if Sweden or Finland were involved in the Cold War conflict going hot, though, it would have been part of a wider Soviet strategy, which was to use the northern part of the continent to isolate Western Europe from North America. And they planned to do this and expected to do this by capturing the North Sea coast of Norway, as I said before. By capturing the North Sea coast, they would deny it to NATO for forward air bases with which NATO could intercept shipping strikes, and they would also provide the Soviets with forward bases for their own naval groups, including attack submarines. So the Soviets more or less viewed Finland and Sweden as kind of speed bumps on the way to the Norway coast, either in the region of this map, or there were also plans to invade Norway from farther south in the Baltic, but we'll focus on their plans for the north. Either way, there were lots of ways to imagine Sweden being drawn into a conflict with the Warsaw Pact, which, of course, means that for many DCS players, Kola equals Viggen. And essentially, the Kola Map gives us a chance to actually really see the Viggen operating on its own home turf. We can fly it from roadway air bases, conducting low-level, deep penetration strikes against actual Soviet territory and Soviet logistics and command and control nodes, as well as interdicting naval convoys in the Barents Sea and maybe even the Gulf of Bothnia. In other words, we will, on the Kola Map, be able to live the Viggen dream. But there are other historical possibilities for the Blue Force employment in the region, too. Now, NATO was not unaware of the Soviet plans for the invasion of northern Norway. NATO's response was expected and planned to consist of rapid reaction forces drawn from multiple countries, including a Canadian battle group, and a U.S. Marine amphibious assault group, complete with, you guessed it, Harriers, as close air support assets. So there is definitely the potential for actually getting the Harrier into this conflict, into a conflict for which it was actually designed, flying from airfields and forward improved bases and supporting Marines in contact and other troops in contact against Soviet forces. Now, a quick word about the kind of Soviet forces we might have expected. The terrain, as you'll see if you fly over the Kola Map, the terrain in this part of the world is not exactly amenable to heavy armored forces or even armor-heavy forces. So it's likely that the Soviet forces that would have been used would have been a combination of amphibiously deployed forces, Soviet Marines, airborne forces, air-deployable forces, but basically lighter weight, probably, than the massive armor formations that one would have expected in Central Europe. And similarly, the NATO forces, like the Marines, and even the Canadian battle group, would have been less armor-heavy, would have been lighter and more mobile. So that gives us some really interesting things to try out in northern Norway, in addition to actually having the Harriers there doing a job they were actually meant to do. So finally, it is also possible to envision operating other aircraft, like the F-14s and the coming F-4, from a United States carrier battle group off the northern coast. The United States might have done this both to support the operations in Norway, but also for potentially providing early warning and interception of Soviet naval airstrikes on Atlantic convoys. It's possible that that might have happened. That would have been a pretty high-risk mission for a carrier, but you never know. So, at any rate, the whole point is that there are lots of possibilities, many of which involve some pretty popular aircraft in DCS that have, either never really found a home, like the Viggen, or which have only really found a home in the heat and dust of the Persian Gulf of the Middle East, rather than in Northern Europe against the Warsaw Pact, which is where they really were designed to be used. So the Kola Map does open some opportunities that we really haven't had in DCS before. Okay, so those are all the reasons why you might want to buy the Kola Map. But do you really want to buy the Kola Map? And in particular, do you want to buy it today in early access? Well, that's a little bit more complicated question. I think, honestly, there are a lot of good reasons not to pick it up. In particular, there's some pretty good reasons not to pick it up in early access, the main one being it's not finished. Not by a long shot. I mean, only about a quarter of the map is fully detailed, and for me, it's really amongst the least interesting parts of the map, because it consists of the area around Murmansk and southwest down into Finland. So I guess if I wanted to spend a lot of time flying Soviet aircraft, that might be attractive, but I don't, so it isn't. Because effectively the only part of the map that has any detail is the part of the map that would effectively be Soviet territory in any Cold War scenario. Because there's no real expectation that Finland would be anything but occupied territory within a couple of days of the balloon going up. So Finland and the actual Soviet part of the Kola Peninsula is basically Soviet territory, and it's the only part of the map that's detailed. Now, the terrain in Finland that has been detailed does resemble the terrain in Sweden, and the developers have thoughtfully provided a couple of roadway air bases, which are a feature in Sweden. But, if you want to make a high-fidelity Viggen mission using a roadway airbase and the right kind of terrain, it seems like an odd thing to have to pretend that Finland is Sweden. I mean, we managed to get all the way here from the Caucasus, but we can't go the last 100 miles across the border into Sweden. Similarly, the part of Norway that would likely be the area of operations for NATO forces, including the Marines and their Harriers, is not very detailed. Although there is one airbase at Bodo that's at least partially completed. And honestly, the other really kind of crippling deficiency for me is that the map has only high summer textures. No spring, fall, and sadly no winter. Because, I mean, if you're going to the Kola Peninsula, you don't go for the summer breezes and the bajillions of bugs. You know, the first thing that I did was set the date in the middle of winter, which I then had to back off to get the sun to come up, which was kind of cool. But once the sun did come up, the grass was still green, the leaves were out, and the flowers were still blooming. It was a disappointment. So, overall, getting the map will give you an idea of where it's going. But it won't really provide you the full-up experience, and, as is the way of things, we do not have, and honestly will likely never have, a reliable idea of when further progress will be made. We just don't. So, unless you're really excited about the kinds of scenarios that you'll only be able to make on the Kola Map, and you want to get them started right away, I'm not sure that you shouldn't just wait it out. I mean, I'm not sorry that I took the plunge, but then, I was pretty much always going to buy the map eventually, so, it's a sunk cost, and if it's a non-performing asset for a while, I can live with it. At any rate, I hope you enjoyed this video. Hope it gives you some good information to make your own decision on. And for now, this is going to be Sidekick, signing off.